Hello again everyone, and welcome back to Linode. In today's video, I'm going to show you guys a very simple method that you can use to ensure that every instance you create from an image is actually created with its own set of SSH host keys. And this is really important. We definitely don't want our Linode servers to all have the same SSH host keys because that's really going to confuse your SSH client. Now, obviously, Cloud Init is a very popular solution for this particular thing, and it's a great solution. But if you don't want to learn the complexities of Cloud Init, there's another way that you can automate the resetting of SSH host keys, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you in today's video. So let's get started. So here on my laptop, what you're seeing right now is my Proxmox cluster. I'm going to create a VM in my cluster to serve as the example for this video, but nothing about this is specific to Proxmox. Now, what I'm going to do is create a virtual machine right here on the first host, PVE1. Again, check out the Proxmox series if you have no idea what I'm talking about. But what I want to do is create a brand new virtual machine. And the VM ID is a Proxmox specific thing. I'm just going to give it a higher number. I just randomly chose 876, probably doesn't matter. And what I'm going to do specifically is set up an Ubuntu server virtual machine. And it will end up being a template, so I'm going to include template in the name. Now in this section, what I'm going to need to do is choose the storage repository where my ISO images are. So at this point, all I'm doing is just choosing the ISO that I want to use to set up a Linux installation with. Again, I'm using Ubuntu Server, so I chose the Ubuntu Server Live image. That should be just fine. I'm going to accept most of the defaults here. I'll give it 2 cores. I'm feeling kind of generous today. And for the memory, I think that's fine. And I'll set it up to use my virtual machine subnet. Again, if none of this makes sense, that's perfectly fine. I have a Proxmox series, but all I'm doing is creating a virtual machine for Ubuntu Server. So if you're following along with me, just create an Ubuntu Server instance however you normally do it, and that should be good enough. So I want to go ahead and start the VM. You should see it show up here on the list, and here it is. The question mark means it's not done yet, and actually it's already done. All right, so the installer for Ubuntu Server has loaded, and what I'm going to do right now is, well, install it. I already have a video on my channel that goes over the installation process for Ubuntu Server, so I'm not going to repeat that here. What I'm going to do instead is just set this up real quick. I'm going to fast forward through the entire process, and then I'll be right back as soon as the installation is done. So at this point, Ubuntu Server has booted up and it's ready to go. Now notice right here that it's talking about SSH host keys. The Ubuntu install image actually takes care of this for us, but the problem is when I turn this into a template, it's not going to reset the host keys again. Anyway, what I'm going to do right now is just press enter. That should bring up the login screen, and you could barely see the login prompt there at the bottom. So I'm going to log in. And I'm going to use SSH for the majority of this video, so I'm just going to grab the IP address, and there it is, it's 10.10.10.213. So I'm going to SSH into that server. And we're in. Now what I'm going to do at this point is reset the machine ID. And this doesn't have anything to do with SSH technically, but it is something that you'll definitely want to do, because if your distribution does use the etc machine ID file and you don't generalize that, then you could be in a situation where all of your virtual machines are fighting for the same IP address. As far as why that is, that's beyond the scope of this video. but I'm going to show you how to fix it. The first thing is we want to find out if we have a machine ID file at all. And I do. If you received an error that the file was not found, then this may not apply to you. If I cat it out, we can see that there's a hash. Now, as a quick summary, this hash right here is actually used as part of the process for requesting an IP address through DHCP. Most operating systems will use the MAC address. This is a little bit more complicated. If you create an image without blanking out the machine ID, then every single virtual machine or physical machine, if you're using physical machines, will receive the same machine ID because the machine ID will be in the image. Now the trick here is you can't delete it. Well, you can, but it won't work. What you want to do instead is blank it out. So what I'm going to do is run sudo and then truncate. I want to set the size of the file to exactly 0. And the file that I want to blank out is, of course, the machine ID. Again, that has nothing to do with SSH, but it is something that we'll want to take care of since we'll be creating an image or template anyway. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is demonstrate the problem and the wrong way to go about this. So don't follow along with me right now. What I'm going to do is shut down the server and create a template of it, and I'm not going to do anything about the host keys, so that way you'll see the error message. All right, so it should be powering down now. And as you can see, it's powered down. So we have the virtual machine right here. So what I'm going to do is actually clone it. I'm not going to convert it to a template just yet, but it's the same difference either way. So I'll clone it. And I'll give it an ID of 877 just to make it show up after the original one. I'm just going to call it Ubuntu server bad number 1. And that should be good enough. And not to be outdone, I'm going to clone it again. And for the ID, I'll give it 878. And I'll call it Ubuntu server bad number 2. Okay, so we have both of the virtual machines that I've just cloned right here. We're going to assume that this was already a template, even though it's not. So let's start these up. So it looks like this one is ready to go already. So I'm going to need to grab the IP address. And it looks like it's already showing that to me right here. It ends in 214. Let's check this one. I'll log in. And this one received an IP address that ends in 215. So we can already tell that they're both getting their own IP address. They're not fighting over the same IP, which is something that might have happened had I not blanked out the machine ID. But let's go back to my terminal. And let's connect to the first machine that I cloned. So I'll say yes. Type in my password. And I'm connected. Now what I'll do is open up another tab. And I'll connect to the second server. Now if we go into the etc SSH directory, and I'll do that on both. You can see that we have the host keys. And I'm in the etc SSH directory, and each of the host keys actually have the word host in the name. So for example, let's look at the contents of one of these files. So here's one of the public keys. We'll just memorize the last few characters here, NNVD. Let's see if this one's any different. It's not. It's the same thing. Now, when I used SSH to connect to the second server, it should have brought up a warning that let me know that the host key is the same. I'm not sure why it didn't do that. Maybe there's something going on with the SSH client config. I'm not quite sure. But normally you should see an error message when the host keys are the same, and the host keys are definitely the same on these two servers. So what I'm going to do right now is delete these servers, and then we'll create a template the right way. Power off that one. And I'll power off this one as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rid of these virtual machines. I don't need them anymore. Want to completely purge it out. And then I'll do the same with this one right here. Let's purge this one as well. And here's the virtual machine that we're going to be using as the template. Let's start it back up. And the reason why I didn't convert it to a template yet is because that's a one-time process. You're not actually able to start a template. I wanted to make sure that I show you the correct method before I turn this into a template. Let's go back to the command line. And in the first tab right here, let's connect to that virtual machine. I believe that was the IP address for it. Let's see if I'm right. And I am. Now, if we count all the contents of the machine ID, we can see that it has data inside it again. So when this machine rebooted, it actually regenerated the machine ID. So again, we're going to need to clear this out. And I'm just running the same exact command as I did before. There's nothing new here. And now that's all set. So how exactly do we create an image and ensure that the SSH host keys are going to be different every time a new instance is created from that image? Well, for that, let's actually go to a web browser here. But what we want to do is go to learnlinux.link/ssh-reset. And that should forward you over to Pastebin, where I have the code right here. And I'll actually put this code in the blog post for this video as well. But we're going to copy all of this text right here. So I'll copy that. Let's go back to the terminal. And what I want to do is type nano. That's just an easy to use text editor. It doesn't matter which editor you use. And what we'll do is name it regenerate_ssh_host_keys.service. So what I'm going to do is paste in the code from the link right in here. Now what I'm going to do is explain this file to you guys so that way you'll understand it. But before I do that, I want to give credit to the person that created this file, which is not me. Actually, I have no idea who created this file. Originally, I found this file as part of Raspberry Pi OS, and you can view this code on their GitHub page, but that's where I discovered it. I'm not really sure if Raspberry Pi OS was the first version of this file, but that's where I saw it, and that's actually where I pulled it from. So I'm definitely not going to take any credit for this file whatsoever, but this solution does work, so regardless of whether or not you're using Raspberry Pi OS, it doesn't matter. If you're using Debian, Ubuntu, it'll work there as well. And what is this file anyway? What this is a systemd unit. Systemd is the init system in most distributions nowadays, and a complete overview when it comes to systemd is beyond the scope of this video, and going over in detail how unit files are structured is also beyond the scope of this video. But what I am going to do is help you guys understand what this file in particular is actually going to do for us. Now here on the second line, we're just giving it a description. There's nothing too fancy about that. Now this line right here is actually important. Before equals ssh.service. We want this particular unit to start before the SSH server starts. And that makes sense because we definitely don't want SSH to start up before the keys are regenerated. We're going to check and see if this file right here exists, SSH keygen, and that's what it's going to use to regenerate the SSH keys. It's a one-shot service type. And these exec start lines right here, those are all commands that will be run as soon as this service starts. The first three of which are going to actually remove the SSH host keys and then regenerate them. But the last exec start right here, this is pretty interesting. notice that it's going to disable via systemctl. It's going to disable the very unit file that we're creating. So essentially what that means is that this is going to run when we enable it and reboot the server. And the last thing this service file is going to do for us is it's going to disable itself. That way you won't have new SSH keys every time you start the server. But if at any point in the future you do want to regenerate the host keys, you simply just enable this unit file and reboot the server. Anyway, let's go ahead and save the file. That's Control-O, and that brings up the save dialog. I'll press Enter, and then Control-X to exit out. Next, what we want to do is change the permissions such that root owns this file. And as you can see here, that is now the case. Next, what we're going to do is move the file that we just created. We want to move it to its final position in the file system. So we're going to move that file, and where we want to move it to is in etc, systemd, and then system. Now we have a bunch of stuff here, but more importantly, here we have the file that we've just created. That's where it needs to be saved. Next, what we want to do is let systemd know to reevaluate itself. So what we're going to do is run sudo and then systemctl daemon-reload. And at this point, we should be able to run systemctl status regenerate SSH hostkeys.service, the one that we just created. It's not running, as you can see, and it's also disabled. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually enable it. Which I've just done. And if we check the status again, we can see that it's enabled. Now normally when it comes to systemd units, we want them to be running as well, but not this time. We just want to have it enabled because it's automatically going to run and then exit as soon as the server reboots. So that should be everything that we have to do when it comes to the SSH host keys. And just to be on the safe side, what I'm going to do is go into the etc SSH directory. Let's cat out the contents of one of the keys. And you know what? It's the same one as last time. So that's easy to remember. Just remember those 4 characters right there. And then what I'm going to do is power this down. And then back here in the browser, we can see that the machine is down. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to right click on this and we're going to convert it into a template. Just be sure that you've made all the changes to the image that you want to make. For example, you can make sure that all the updates are installed, your favorite packages are installed, whatever you want. Because once you convert it to a template, you can't unconvert it. So I'll click on it. I'll say yes. And as you can see here, the icon changed. And I know this is specific to Proxmox, but on your end, if you have Clonezilla or maybe some other solution, you can take an image or create a template of your virtual machine or your physical machine, whatever it is, with your chosen solution. Because now after you create a new instance from that image or template, new instances should not have the same host keys. But let's go ahead and test that though. So I'll right click on it and clone it. And for the ID, I'll give it 877. I'll just call it Ubuntu test. Let's clone it. So here's the virtual machine. Let's go ahead and start it up. Looks like it's ready. And it received an IP address ending in 216. Easy enough. So we still have the output right here for when I catted out the contents of the public key for this host key here. Let's go ahead and SSH in and see what happens. And as you can see, it's obviously different. If I scroll up a little bit here, this was the last portion of the host key, the specific host key, before I created the template. And now, when I created a new instance from the template, as you can see, the host keys are actually different. So as you can see, we were able to automate the process of regenerating host keys on instances that are created from an instance or template. Mission success. So there you go. I hope today's video was helpful in showing you guys my method for resetting SSH host keys. I think it's an easier solution if you don't want to use something like Cloudinit, although I do recommend you learn Cloudinit eventually. But for right now, this is a perfectly valid way to do it to make sure that every instance created from an image has its own set of SSH host keys. Let us know what you thought about this video down in the comments below. I look forward to reading what you guys have to say, and I'll see you again very soon.